Buy a home in 2021 or wait for the crash? Will the housing market crash soon, or will prices continue to rise sharply? We're going to talk about that, and I feel pretty good about my prediction. I think every single person I speak to is asking me these questions. Should I buy a house now? Are we in a bubble? In 2017, I wrote this article about predicting the next housing crash. At that time, based on some very basic historic trends, I predicted that we would be at the bottom of the market with the highest supply and lowest demand in 2026, 5 years from now. But we have had some major disruptions, and as you'll see in a minute, disruptions change the somewhat predictable cycle of real estate ebbs and flows. I believe the real estate landscape has changed drastically since last year, and that the very steady rhythm of real estate prices has been knocked off its axis. Before we can consider what might happen in the future, you need to understand some basic truths about real estate and what makes it fluctuate in value in the first place. As I just said, real estate ebbs and flows are relatively consistent and also somewhat predictable, and have exhibited a steady rhythm noted by economist Homer Hoyt since the 1800s. You can see from this chart that there's typically about an 18-year cycle from peak to peak. You'll also notice a couple of periods of major disruptions when the 18-year cycle didn't happen. The two periods that didn't follow the typical progression were the years that included World War II and the Fed doubling of the interest rate in the 1970s, which created a shorter cycle, i.e. the market peaked and started to fall much earlier than it would have if the Fed had not acted. I think the big idea here is that markets are predictably regular unless something happens to disrupt them, and I think we can all agree that something big happened in 2020. Okay, so you get that there's a typical boom-bust cycle of 18 years. Before we start talking about the criteria that are creating the exception to this trend in our current market, let's look at the 4 phases of market expansion and contraction and the indicators that we can use to tell where we are currently in this cycle. You have to understand this before you can start analyzing how this market is different, because what we are ultimately talking about is behavioral economics. When life doesn't go according to plan, like it hasn't since 2020, people's behavior often changes in ways that we don't expect. So understanding the typical markers of the cycle is necessary before we can start projecting that behavioral change into the future. Real estate and finance expert Glenn Mueller clarified the boom-bust cycle originally identified by political economist Henry George sometime around 1876, as you can see in this image. Phase 1 of the cycle is the recovery phase. This is after the market has dropped out during a recession like in 2008. I feel like it makes more sense if we talk about recession or phase 4 first, because it's like the bottom and then we're moving up toward the peak. This is how Teo Nicolai, real estate entrepreneur at the Harvard Extension School, describes recession. We know the characteristics of a recession: high unemployment, decreased consumption, and decreased company investment in buildings, factories, and machines. The price of land, essential for economic activity, is at its lowest point in the cycle. Then comes phase 2, recovery. Nicolai continues, as population increases, so does the demand for goods and services. This expansion is typically hastened by government intervention in the form of lowered interest rates, the key ingredient for investment. With increasing demand and lower investment costs, companies expand their businesses. They hire more people, build new factories, and buy more machines. This expansion adds to the demand for land and buildings on which the economic activity can take place. Vacancy across all real estate asset classes, office, retail, residential, etc., decreases as companies use previously empty buildings and individuals move into previously vacant homes. So notice the two things that he said increases the demand for goods and services: population growth and low interest rates. Hold on to that idea. We're going to talk about that again, but I also want you to notice that the growth cycle affects all areas of real estate. If commercial real estate activity is growing, so is residential. But think about this. With so many companies going to permanent work from home status for many of its employees, how will the connection between office real estate demand and residential real estate demand change? Some of that activity that would be purchasing or leasing new office space is shifting into the residential space. The number of people wanting a home office has shot through the roof, and when it happens by the millions all at once, it has a measurable impact on both commercial and residential property demands. That commercial and residential growth wouldn't mirror one another as they always have in the past. Some of that commercial demand is pushing into the residential space, creating an additional stream of pressure or demand for residential real estate. And this is in many cases seems to be a permanent change. After phase 1 comes phase 2, expansion. The expansion phase happens when people or companies have taken all the available space. There's limited supply, and as buyers and renters have fewer options, rents and housing prices prices start to increase. The only way to decrease the rising prices is to increase supply. That is where builders come in and start building. They expand the inventory. But what's happening right now? Are builders expanding the inventory? Well, they're really trying to, but they're definitely not keeping up with demand. In the most popular locations in my area, builders are using lottery systems to handle the number of buyers that's vastly outweighing the number of lots available. There are two issues that's causing the bottleneck. One is that the materials are difficult to get because of the shutdown of many manufacturing plants in 2020 due to what happened last year. So that's a temporary thing that will likely get better as we get further away from 2020 and builders are able to get those materials they need to build houses. But the second reason is the sheer volume of the population increase in cities across the country. Builders can't keep up with the demand. Lots can't be subdivided fast enough and permits can't be ordered fast enough for the number of people moving to new areas that want to buy homes. So that is one of the indicators of expansion, population growth. And we're experiencing that now, not from a generation coming of age or mass immigration from other countries, but in a way we're experiencing a mass national migration because so many Americans now have the freedom to live wherever they want to live because of the work from home economy. And of course, the other indicator of the expansion phase is the interest rates, and rates have been low for some time. Usually the Fed lowers the rates when the economy is struggling. Rates had been increasing steadily before 2020 because the economy was really hot, and in 2019 the unemployment rate was 3.5%, the lowest it's been since 1969. This is a great place to debunk the myth that interest rates and home prices are directly tied. Yale economist Robert Shiller says there is not a tight fit at all between the two. High mortgage rates do not translate automatically into low home prices. And you can see from this graphic dating back to as far as 1880 that the interest rates themselves are not indicative of rising and falling prices. And think about it. If the Fed raises rates when the economy is healthy, that's usually a time when people are doing well and buying power is high. So it makes sense that rates wouldn't have a major impact on housing prices. It does have some impact, obviously. There was some correlation in the rate hike of the 1970s, but it isn't as clear a connection as some believe. A raise in interest rates is not going to cause a market crash in and of itself. Phase 3 is hypersupply. Hypersupply is when the increase in inventory exceeds the demand for housing. As long as the current demand exceeds the supply, there will be upward pressure on housing costs. As long as that is happening, new construction is financially feasible and builders will continue to create more supply in the market. But as soon as that supply overtakes demand, we will move into phase 4, which is recession. All right, now let's think about this. Which phase are we currently in? Phase 1, recovery, increasing demand and low interest rates. Phase 2, expansion, builders expanding the inventory. Phase 3, hypersupply, too much inventory for the demand. Or phase 4, recession and prices fall. So where are we in the cycle? I'll tell you where I think we are at the end of the video, but first there are two things we need to discuss that could completely upend everything that I just said. The changing economy from in-person work to work from home, and the 10 million Americans currently out of work who some people have said are going to be pushed into foreclosure, opening up new inventory in the market and allowing home buyers more options. Some are speculating that this foreclosure tsunami will push us into the hypersupply phase with a recession shortly to follow. Let's do a quick recap of what we know, and these are all the things that together are impacting the current real estate market. Interest rates are the lowest they have ever been in history. 56% of Americans have said they are planning a move in 2021. The list of huge corporations that have gone permanently work from home is long. Some examples of those include Facebook, Verizon, Google, Indeed, Microsoft, and it keeps going. Builders continue to have difficulty getting inventory on the ground and are experiencing the same kind of competition we're seeing in existing homes. The U.S. unemployment rate has dropped continuously from 14% in April 2020 down to the most recent rate available in January 2021 of 6.3%. A healthy unemployment rate is somewhere between 4 and 5%. Economists project to reach 5% sometime in 2021. 10 million Americans are out of work from the impact of 2020. Let's talk first about the unemployment number. There are 10 million Americans out of work since 2020. How is that going to impact the real estate market? Are they really going to lose their homes to foreclosure, and those homes will create the inventory that will push us into the hypersupply phase? I'm going to go out on a limb and say that that will not even have a drop in the bucket effect on our real estate market. Not even a drop. Think about this. Remember what I said, that 56% of Americans are planning on moving in 2021? We don't really know how many of those are home buyers who plan to purchase another home, renters who are planning on purchasing for the first time, or renters who are simply moving to a new rental property. But we do know that just under 10% of Americans moved in 2019, about 31 million people. And we know that in 2019, approximately 6 million homes were sold, existing and new construction combined. That means that there is projected to be about a 460% increase in the number of Americans Americans moving in 2021 from 2019. If we multiply the 6 million homes sold in 2019 by that 460% increase, we get an estimated demand of 27 million homes in 2021. Now, of course, there are a lot of unknowns here, but does it seem reasonable to suppose that if 10 million homes suddenly hit the market due to foreclosure, that we would quickly be pushed into a hypersupply situation? And this is assuming that all the 10 million unemployed are homeowners, which I seriously doubt. It doesn't seem likely. Will this alone cause a crash? I am not convinced. If those 10 million people lose their homes, and for most of them, it won't be to foreclosure, they will sell them at a profit, or maybe they won't even sell them at all. With prices rising, they could pay back any forbearance once they got to work again with a cash refinance, but that's a whole different story. The main point is those homes, assuming they do hit the market rather than refinance, won't even be a drop in the bucket for the number of homes we need for the people wanting to buy a new home around the country. And that brings us to my projections. Where are we in the cycle of recovery, expansion, hypersupply, and recession? I think where I am in Raleigh, North Carolina, we're somewhere at the end of phase 1 and beginning of phase 2. Builders are trying to build inventory, but they're not succeeding. This is the story for many cities throughout the United States. At least in cities like Raleigh that have become hot relocation markets, I can't really see an imminent crash in housing prices. The quality of life concerns that are bringing many to markets like this area, such as lower crime, good schools, available recreation, and the like, are not likely to go away anytime soon. To see a crash, we would have to see a steep drop in demand or a steep increase in supply. If something happened to prevent everyone who wanted to move from moving and housing prices leveled out a bit, there would still likely be a new set of buyers who would keep the housing market active for a while, those who currently live in the area and would like to move locally but are worried about inventory shortages in the current situation. Without a crystal ball, which none of us have, my best guess is that a crash here is not on the near horizon. If you like this video, you might like this one about 2021's best cities to relocate to. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.